I think I think I'm sort of showing some signs of tree pollen allergies. So don't take the occasional Kleenex to mean anything other than that. So.
I have the same problem. I was at the grocery store and had the nerve to sneeze. I did have a mask on, but it was enough to like terrify people within 30 feet of me.
Everybody stopped in place, right?
The hazmat team came out. So
right, you need a little sign: allergies, seasonal allergies. Yeah.
So we're waiting for John, Corrine, and David to come on. So
okay, great.
How's your new duties doing for you, Susan?
Oh my heavens, Mel. It's like drinking from a fire hose. This week is better than last week. I did not realize that having been retired for 3 months, I would have started to lose some of my brain.
Yeah.
But I did. So, excuse me, I'll shut that off. But it's fun sitting in a different seat. And I'll be spending
bigger perspective.
It is a different perspective, definitely. I actually made a decision last week that was not in Manchester's best interest, but was in other colleges, and I realized I had crossed over in some way. I am, one of the things that the feedback we've received is that you all in the legislature would like to see the chancellor more. So I'm going to be having lunch there at least once a week so that people can count on it, and visiting people and seeing if we can make a stronger connection between the system and the legislature.
Oh, that's terrific, Susan.
Hi, Corrine. How are you?
Yeah, and Susan, I think it's going to be more important than ever now, too.
Yes, well, my goal, of course, is to set up whoever the next person is going to be in good stead with all of you, and have, a very smooth transition from Ross through me to the next individual. So, and we obviously have a few things we need to attend to. So,
a lot of challenges
with the legislature. Yeah. And a number have popped up in the last 2 weeks. So, but.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hey, guys. Sorry, my camera's off. This is my first chance to eat lunch today.
Oh, that's all right. It's not stopping Dick Ames from...
Figured I'd spare you.
Who are we waiting for here?
We're waiting for John and David. We'll wait just a couple more minutes, and then we can start with who we have here.
Great.
I recall getting a note from David saying he couldn't make it today to this meeting.
Did he?
Yeah.
I didn't see that.
I'll go back and look, but that's my memory. I'll take a look.
We'll just wait to see if John comes on in the next 5 minutes or so.
Yes, David Ryan did decline this invitation. He's not able to join today.
Okay, so we're just waiting for John. We'll wait for a couple more minutes and then we'll start. I see we have 14 people listed. Does that mean they're listening, Jordan, or what?
So yes, we've got 9 folks here on the call, and we've got another 5 listening in via phone.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so why don't we get started? We are missing John Morgan and
I'll give him a
Dave Ryan, but let's get started. So let's call the meeting to order. I want to welcome those that are here, joining us today, both visually and non-visually here. A few notes before we begin. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the Commission's website. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Before we begin, we need to take roll. And if there's anyone in the room present with you during the meeting, please let us know. So I'll start. I'm Mel Myler, Chair of the committee. I'm calling in from Kentucky, New Hampshire, and I'm in my home office alone. Susan, why don't you go next?
I'm Susan Heward. I'm calling in from Hooksett, New Hampshire, and I'm alone.
Good. Okay, David?
Dave Luno from Hopkinton, New Hampshire, and with Ozzy the long-haired dachshund.
Oh,
Corinne? You want to unmute her, Jordan? Okay, there you go, Corinne. You're good.
I'm all set?
Yeah.
Okay, Corinne Cascadden. I am in the SAU 84 Littleton School District office. My door is closed and I'm by myself in the room.
Excellent. Okay, John, you want to introduce yourself and where you are and if anybody's in there with you?
No.
I'm John
I've already got to
Morgan.
go. To focus on
in
this. Sorry. Yeah.
Brentwood, New Hampshire, in my 4-year-old William is in the room with me.
Great. Thank you very much. Michelle? You want to check in, Michelle?
Yep, my name is Michelle Holt Shannon, staff with New Hampshire Listens, and I am in my living room in Dover, New Hampshire, and occasionally my spouse or daughter might swing by, but no one's in the room with me right now.
Thank you. Bruce? Bruce?
Bruce Mallory with the Carsey School in New
Looks
Hampshire.
like-
Calling in from Kittery Point, Maine. Nobody's in the room with me.
Okay. Jennifer?
Hi, I'm calling in from Concord. Nobody's here with me.
Thank you very much. Dick Ames, please.
Yeah, I'm here and in Jaffrey alone.
Thank you very much. All right, so I also want to note that there will not be a, and Jordan, you want to check in, please?
Yeah, Jordan with the Carsey School, calling in from Dover, just me in the room here.
Okay, and a nice background, I might add.
Mhm.
Also, I want to also please note that there will not be a period for public comment during these meetings, but listeners may view the website of the commission hosted by the Carsey School and provide a comment using that link. The commission website, by the way, for those that are listening, is school funding, all one word, .commission@unh.edu. Once again, it's school funding, one word, .commission@unh.edu. Also, go to the website if you're interested. It has, believe me, it has all kinds of terrific information on it, from school funding. All the lawsuits are there. The commission meetings have been there. I mean, it's a very rich site if you're interested in school funding issues. We'll use the following. We'll use the agreements that we met that we've agreed to in the meetings earlier. Let me just review those for the panel here today. First, the issue is to listen first, be open-minded. It's okay to disagree, but don't personalize it. Focus on the idea, not the person. And if you disagree, consider asking a question rather than arguing to prove a point. We've also agreed to accepting work through conflict to its resolution as a catalyst for learning. It's okay to put issues like race and class on the table. Be purposeful and to the point. Notice if you are conveying, if your conveying is or is not pertinent to the topic at hand. Take risks, be raggedy, make some mistakes, then let it go. And finally, we all share the responsibility for making the group productive. Looking at the calendar, our next committee meeting, I believe, is on the 18th. Is that correct, Bruce? It's on the 18th? Okay. Before we start, I'd like to make just a couple of comments. Public engagement in this time of pandemic era is obviously going to be difficult. Gathering of human beings together is challenging, and how we gather information from the public is going to be key. Our role as we gather, as other work groups begin to gather data and content and concepts, we need to seek input on this information, but also give feedback to those work groups of what we find from the public. The activities that we're involved in will build to have an informed citizenry so that we can have an informed dialogue. But this is a complex issue, and we all know that. I think one of the things we're going to need to do as we engage community participants is to lay that foundation of what is school funding, how does it work, so as we begin to look at some of the new things that will be coming forward, that there'll be a foundation for that conversation to take place. So I think with that, let's begin to look at the agenda and the task review. We did pass out to you earlier the grid that indicates the various areas that we're going to have to deal with. And those areas are some stakeholder focus groups, the survey with the UNH Center, trying to identify how we gather student voice. Some may question the issue of student voice. I'm of the feeling that students bring to schools a whole wealth of information that I didn't do as a student. And so our challenge is to try to gather from them some of the issues that they're finding in schools that would help our study. Then we're also going to deal with some statewide conversations, and then with a summary report. So let's look at some of these. Activities. The question is that we may be having is, what is the online and what might the online engagement look like? I'm going to turn to Michelle, because Michelle is our contact. She's a director of New Hampshire Listens, so she's got a vast degree of experience in holding these public forums. The New Hampshire Listens itself has around 160 trained facilitators out throughout the state that have been conducting a variety of different dialogues around the state. So Michelle, could you give us a little background on how this might work?
Sure. I think a couple of things, as we explore, this committee's weighing in on the questions that are important, the information that people need to have. When we're thinking about the how, the hardest group to reach are people who don't have a lot of money, because they're impacted by access in a lot of different ways, transportation, technology, those kinds of things. And so when we think about who to target with online and take advantage of the time, in the next few months that would be online, we have to keep that in mind and make sure that we make up for that in other ways in our overall design process. And as you'll see, there's times when we're meeting with certain kinds of stakeholders, and other times where we're just doing an all call in a community. Basically, right now we're in a Zoom webinar, but we have been hosting conversations on Zoom meeting where everyone who wants to join can join. You can have over 100 people in a Zoom meeting. There's technology that makes it possible to break out into breakout groups and still get a small group conversation. If you haven't done that, I can actually show you how it works at some point, so you can experience it. We say it's a little bit like being teleported into a little breakout room, and then people come back. So there's ways to hear from people by being in a small group, by commenting in a large group, by having people comment and take notes in the chat. And there's other tools that we can use to collect information from people who are participating. So technologically, it can be very engaging, and we can take advantage of this time with some of the tools that we have. I think the main thing for us, and I'm happy to answer questions about, more about what that looks like. I think the thing we have to think about in terms of transparency and making it meaningful is, who are we gathering when, and is this a group where we won't there won't be a big loss of the kinds of folks that we're trying to gather if we're going to do something online. Kind of the same thing that teachers are struggling with right now. So, how can we make sure we're reaching all of our students? We need to think about the method so that across all of our engagement, we're able to reach anyone who wants to participate.
Are there questions of Michelle, as we, in reaction to her comments?
I have a question.
Sure, Susan.
Michelle, you've talked about people who might be challenged by the technology. I'm also concerned about people who don't think that they should even comment on this, that even though it's important to them, they don't think their voice will be heard. What are your thoughts on reaching that group as well?
Yeah, I think, I think that the commission and a lot of the effort that the commission has made so far to make sure we're sending messages of welcome. In the end, the best invitation is a personal invitation. That is hard to replicate in any other way. So even though we'll have a communication process and we'll be asking commissioners and work group members to reach out, we'll be asking school leaders and community leaders to reach out to their communities. Ultimately, as many people we can reach with a personal invitation, it will actually, that tends to pay off. And so while every community in New Hampshire is one we hope to involve, we know we're going to have to focus a little bit and do a little thinking around making sure we get large and medium and small communities and communities that have a lot of students and a few students and a mix of politically swinging communities. So lots of different ways we want to cut and slice so that we have a mix of voices. So I think once we know sort of some of the narrowing of the geography, it'll help us narrow and personalize our invitations to as many people as possible.
Thank you. Other questions of Michelle? Okay. Looking at the agenda here, I want to skip over the student voice one for just a moment. The granite poll, we will be able to add to the granite poll that. What time in June does that usually go out? Do you know? What time is that usually administered?
I'm going to ask Bruce to answer that.
June, Bruce, do you know that?
Sure, it's a quarterly poll. And so it'll go out in June and again in September. So right now on this work plan, It indicates June. I think we should probably work with our consulting firm to be sure we're asking the right questions on that poll. Better to get the questions right and do it in September than just to get something out in June for the sake of getting something out. So I think that date is to be confirmed. We can add roughly 8 to 10 questions on the quarterly Granite State poll, or we do have the resources to design a dedicated survey of New Hampshire residents just focused on school funding. So that's a question that this engagement working group might want to take on to advise what it is you want to get out of a statewide representative sample of state residents about school funding.
Yeah, the question that I would have is that there are two different types of questions that can be asked. One are inquisitive ones, which are trying to seek information on particular questions. Another question, or another part of the survey, might be those to deal with some of the issues as we begin to unfold the critical questions that are coming from the two other groups, the two other work groups. That would be more confirming kind of questions rather than inquisitive kinds of questions. You see what I'm trying to say there? I mean, one is to seek information from people, which I think is important, on general topics that we're considering. The second is we've kind of come to some conclusions, and that we need the input out of the survey on some of those conclusions. So I'm not quite sure, as we look at the survey, if it's only one survey we're going to be able to engage with theirs, or maybe the second survey you were talking about just a minute ago, Bruce, that would be more of from a result of some of the work that the other work groups have done, and be a little bit later in the process.
If I can comment on that.
Yes, yeah.
Probably there'd be greater value in sharing with the public some broad options that the commission has begun to identify through the summer and into the early fall, and use the UNH Survey Center to test the public response to those various options. They may not be highly detailed or crafted, but there'll be some broad options about how we think about an adequate education and how to fund an adequate education. I'm a little concerned that if we did a general sort of attitude poll earlier in the process, let's say by June, we wouldn't necessarily get as informed responses or specific responses as that would be helpful to the commission specifically. I think that right now we could say that a lot of people, based on past surveys, we know that people are concerned about funding of public education in our state. We know that people are concerned about how they themselves pay for it, or how their communities pay for it. We know that people are concerned in general about the differences in the ability of local communities to pay for public education. So honestly, I'm not sure what new information we'd get early on, but if we can go through a process of informing the public of the directions, the options that the commission may be considering, in combination with the community conversations that are also slated for the fall, I think that would probably be the optimal kind of arrangement.
Yeah, I was just gonna add that it would be complementary to the community conversations, because you'd have two different sources of inputs. One is a random sample vis-a-vis that of actual the engagement process. Susan, Karine, and John, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I actually have a prior question, Mel. Bruce, could you describe the Granite State poll? I confess I'm not familiar with it.
Well, it's as I said, it's a quarterly poll. I believe it goes out to about 600, randomly selected New Hampshire residents, 18 years old and over. And the UNH Survey Center, of course, is known for, during presidential cycles and primary cycles, taking opinion polls about the kinds of preferences that people have politically. It also asks general questions like, do you think the state's going in the right or wrong direction? It might test very specific, in the past, it's tested specific policy questions. Should recreational marijuana be legalized? Should we have casinos, expanded gambling or gaming in our state? And so typically the UNH Survey Center polls, the Granite State polls, are tied specifically to concerns or issues or policy questions in the state of New Hampshire, and it asks for people's attitudes about that. Sometimes their knowledge about it as well.
Thank you.
That answer, is that good, Susan? So based on that clarification, Susan, Corinne, and John, what's your sense of the June poll vis-a-vis doing something in September in the fall?
Some of my doctoral research was using those Gallup polls that was conducted the Granite State. So it's already an established survey. And I think for me, that would be the better route to add 8 to 10 questions because it's already established and it's already got a process in place. I'm not sure what the returns are. The returns fairly high. And then it would eliminate a whole new survey to be developed because then you got to re-educate the group about the survey. It just seems like it'd be smoother for me to collect, to glean that data on the questions that are specific to the school funding issue because it's already an established survey. In terms of June to September, I think September would be the better route to go. People are still reeling on this June. June is still close to this COVID transition and uproar in our lives. And maybe things will settle down by September, so you might get more valid data from it. Just my opinion.
Great. Susan, what's your sense on the timing?
Yeah, I agree with Corinne. I was just thinking about no matter what kind of question we formulate, people are dealing with schooling at home.
Yeah.
And so no matter how we ask the question, that's what they're thinking about. And if we ask about an adequate education, it almost sounds like a parental indictment. Did you do a good job with your child? So September gives us some space. Again, it may not be better, but it might be more accurate.
On that comment, Susan, I've heard some people say the reaction, some of the parents says, oh, it's not the teacher's fault. John, how about you? What's your sense on the timing?
I'm not optimistic on the timing for either of the options. Is that, I think I'm just being totally, I'm just being totally honest with you right now. I don't think that it works now because I don't think that anyone is thinking about this right now. And I don't think it works in September when we're very close to an upcoming election, and also we don't know what's going to happen with the virus and whether or not schools are even going to reopen, especially if there's a second more catastrophic wave, as is predicted in some of the models. So I apologize for kind of the downer comments, but I feel like I'm doing everyone a disservice if I don't share that.
Well, let's do this. Yeah, I think there's a conclusion here, regardless of John, what you just said, because I agree with you, that June is too soon. That we need to move it at least to September, and I think Jennifer, Bruce, we would need to know what the timing is of when they would need to have some questions for that survey in September, and let's say if it's August or something like that, or mid-August, they need those questions. We can revisit that timing in one of our meetings that we have in either August or late July, and that way we'll have a better sense. I think you're right, John. We have a better sense of where the virus is and what we're going to do with the actual schools opening. So let's, if we can agree we'll hold on the June, move it to September, revisit it in the summertime to see if in fact, if even September is a good time to do it. Can we agree to all that? Okay.
Yes.
All right, so that decision's made then. Now, the first item that's on the chart here is stakeholder group meetings. Now, we did have a stakeholder group meeting in March where we invited some of the key advocate groups in to give feedback. They gave us our feedback. We're now looking at moving those stakeholder group meetings out sometime in May in the 9 regions. Now, the issue of the 9 regions was interesting because Michelle and I were talking about it earlier, and you say, well, why 9 regions? And we sent to you earlier in the email a map of the 9, was it the economic regions that are in the state?
Yep, it's I can chime in on this, Mel. There were 4 slides, and one was the 10 counties, one was 24 Senate districts, one was 9 planning regions,
Right, yeah.
and the 4th was 7 economic regions.
Right. And so, and I think those would be kind of inclusive of which ones we want to use to try to have these 2 meetings of stakeholders. Now, these are people not necessarily from the advocate groups, but people who are actually working out in the field. And that list of stakeholder groups was also part of the handout that was sent to you. And that was on page 5 of the handouts. That indicates at least some suggestions of some of the groups the stakeholder groups that might be in these sessions. So I think the first thing we need to do is to conclude how many regions do we need to have these, and I'm assuming these, based upon Michelle, your comments, these would be kind of Zoom meetings with these individuals later this month. So the first question is, how many regions should we focus on? And I would say either the 7 or the 9. And then we can deal with how we're going to identify folks to come to these meetings. So what's your sense about the number of regions we should consider these? Raise your hand if you've got a comment. This is part of participatory conversation here. So
I don't have an issue with how you have the regions. I was having a hard time separating my ideas or thoughts on communities that weren't actually listed, but realized they still are within that region.
Yeah.
So I didn't have a problem with it. Like I was thinking of Conway area. You know, should they be included in the Androscoggin Valley region or Lakes region, or is it not important that they would get the invitation to attend any of the regions anyway, or participate in any of the regions?
one of the advantages we have, I think, with the Zoom is you don't have the transportation question.
That is
Because I know
true. Distance doesn't matter.
Corinne, believe me, I've been up in the North Country. In fact, when I got my job with the NEA, one of the leaders in the North Country says, "We'll know how much you like the North Country, the number of times you get your ass over the pass." And I spent a lot of time up in the North Country, so I know it well.
Well, right now we're not letting anybody over that pass.
Yeah, exactly right. Other questions about the number of the 7 or the 9, if that's what we want to focus on.
Yeah, I don't have an issue with it.
No issue here either.
No, I'm sure it was strategic, so
Yeah.
I trust the system.
So Michelle, what's your thoughts on it?
Well, and I'll just say the most recent version, has the regions that we shared on slides. There was a list that had specific towns noted, but that was incomplete. And so we removed it because it wasn't clear what the background was of which communities were there. And so the goal is to be clear about the meaning of why, which, groups and which towns and which reasons. and to be transparent about that. So when we present to you kind of details about what this could look like, and we do get to a point where we're saying, all right, in this region where anyone can come, but we're focusing on these 3 towns so that our outreach, can be specific. We want to be able to say why. So we will get more specific about towns. So your point about towns being listed or not, Corinne, I think is a good one. And I think the main thing that I'll just repeat is that in any region, we'll do enough kind of broad outreach so that anyone could join, even though we'll do some extra outreach in strategic places so that more of that personal outreach can happen. It just tends to be a way to get more folks to feel like they really are invited and to participate.
Okay, that'll work.
So the first step then, Michelle, as I understand it, you're going to identify the regions and some of the communities that definitely need to be involved in this first dialogue that we're going to have. That's part one. Then
Yep.
Part two is how do we get, who will attend those meetings? And that is on, I referred to on page 5, at least of my handout, where we have the broad categories of potential people. How are those populated then? How are those selected?
What's
Michelle,
your question there, Mel?
The question is that as you look at these categories,
Mhm.
from board, taxpayers, people of color, local business people, cities, local elected officials, school leaders, how are these individuals selected to participate in the session?
Okay.
And you're referring to page 5 in the summary?
Right, exactly. This was just again a brainstorm of who might be there.
Right.
So it's just a general question of how do we populate the conversation.
Right. And one of the things I'll answer your question, and one of the things that we can talk about is just have each of you look and see, who are we missing.
So Mel, I was still stuck on the regional groupings.
Yeah.
And so did you decide to move forward with the 9 planning regions, the RPC?
I wanted to leave that to Michelle
Okay.
to see which is going to be the most efficient way to do that. It might be 7, might be 9.
Well, they're really different. That's the thing. So I went online to look at the planning regions. So those are the regions defined by the regional planning commissions. Am I right, Michelle?
The 9 are regional planning commissions.
Regional planning commissions. So they're geographic regions that don't necessarily. I mean, they're basically grouped geographically. They're not. There's no other connection there. And I think there's a lot of value in that because I'm trying to. Where's the PowerPoint I was looking at? So like in the, the I think it's region 6 maybe. I can't read it in the.
Are you in the planning regions?
Yeah, I'm on the focus group map options PowerPoint.
Yep.
And a lot of different communities with different socioeconomic capacity. You've got seacoast towns as well as, I'm not quite sure if Dover's I think Dover's in that region. And then when you get up to region 1, it's basically Coos County. And I don't know how much diversity you're going to have within that region, but you're certainly going to have an economic voice there. I don't know if the economic regions might might be a better targeting. I hate using, sorry to use the word targeting, a better plan, because you won't have voices drowned out, I guess.
I guess I'm curious if other folks have an inclination of which regions on those slides kind of speak to you as being salient in that, because of what you just said, Dave.
I mean, I think there's pros and cons to both. I mean, from, something Mel talks a lot about, which is we got to go from my kids to our kids. You want everybody to hear that message. And if we go with economic regions, then there may be some with higher economic capacity and some with lower economic capacity, and as opposed to a more diversity of opinions. Mel, Bruce has got his hand up.
Yeah, okay.
Let me just say a little bit about the intended design for this in our contract with the commission. Within each region, we're envisioning 2 focus groups in 2 separate locations within each region. Some of these regions are big, whether you go by the planning regions or the economic regions. They're big. And so the assumption is that we would try to locate, my old thinking keeps kicking in. I haven't killed this old thinking yet. It would actually have people coming together.
Yeah.
Right. It's a Zoom environment. It's an online environment. But in any case, we can do outreach within sort of sub areas within each of those regions, so that the participants in each focus group, and there'll be 8 to 10 participants in each of the 2 focus groups per region, can be drawn from sort of more specific targeted areas within those, so we can capture some of the diversity that is represented even within regions where you've got pretty large regions like Lakes Region. I mean, the diversity within Lakes Region or COAS, of course, is just huge. So I think especially with the online version that we're envisioning now, we'll be able to identify specific communities and ask our partners in those communities, superintendents, principals, business leaders, to themselves or to identify folks who can be a participant in these relatively small selected focus groups. Again, the purpose of this is, because it's early on, it's over the next 6 weeks or so, is to help the commission be sure that it's paying attention to those concerns that are most important to local so-called stakeholders, education leaders, business leaders, community leaders, to shape the analysis and research that the commission will be doing over the summer and into the fall.
So as we look at these 2 maps that were given to us, the planning versus the 9 versus the 7, based upon your comments, Bruce, it would seem to me that whether we have the 7 or the 9, it'd be the number, we're just dealing with the number of how many of these are going to hold, because regardless of which of the maps you use, you're going to be gathering people from those respective areas anyway. So I don't know, what do you folks think?
The goal is just to get
people together. I mean,
capture a wide range of local experiences relative to public education, paying for, delivering public education, and the experiences of, again, all kinds of folks with that. So honestly, what's most important is identifying enough different sort of clusters of communities that we then extend invitations to join an online focus group, and the kind of catchment area or boundaries around economic regions or planning regions is kind of an artifact. It just simply helps our thinking to be sure that we are capturing folks from all over the state and across diverse kinds of communities.
Any other reaction to that? Well, I would say, yeah.
I have a question about the maps again, because I've just found them. Is there a difference in the boundaries between the planning regions and the Senate districts? Or are they the same?
They're not.
Well, it
the-
looks like there's a bit of a difference, yeah.
Yeah.
There
There
is
are
a bit of a
24
difference.
Senate districts,
Yeah.
and there are only 9 planning regions.
Oh, yeah, I see the difference. Okay.
Yeah.
I was just looking at the colors.
Well, I would suggest that we go with the 7 economic regions. That would be my suggestion.
Mel, if I might
Sure, Jay, yeah.
just offer, if you want recruitment to attend to come from another independent source, the planning commissions, and I'm pretty close with mine. It's 36 communities, and I think that they organize them very well. They've got established communication channels. I don't know how you exactly get to the 7. I'm really not tracking on the chart, but I understand the efficiency, so you may want to go another way. But if you want to use that channel, I think it's pretty effective in this part of New Hampshire.
Jay, I apologize. Will you say which channel you were talking about again? I just want to make sure.
It's the planning commissions.
Okay, yep.
Right.
Because there's really, if you look at those 36 communities, there's nothing that would exactly link them. Maybe Mount Monadnock's in the middle of it. But in the end, they come together regularly because of that commission. But just
That makes sense, Jay. So what are your thoughts, folks? Go with the 9? Shake of the head, whatever you want to do. Okay.
Yeah, I'm good with the 9.
Okay. All right. So let's decide then. Decision would be that we'll go with the 9 regions, 2 in each of those regions. Now, the next question, Michelle, is how do we populate these focus groups? How's that done?
I think what we'll do is come back to you with the mapped out sort of who we're trying to reach in that catchment area. And then where it's kind of back to what Bruce said. Who are our partners? How can we get the word out? There's the broad outreach, and then the specific outreach to, that's as personal as possible, kind of both layers. Bruce, do you want to say more about that part?
No, the folks who brought together March 5th, representing school administrators, school boards, principals, teachers, business leaders, those are the folks we'll go back to and say, remember when we brought you together, and remember the work of the commission. We'd now like you to identify, these kinds of folks from your communities. Please send us their contact information. We'll then reach out to them to make this invitation and see who's available. So it's working through those partnership channels, region by region, planning region by planning region, that we've done. That's the kind of thing we've done in the past. We have a good relationship with the planning regions around the state. I do think that they're well connected to their own constituencies in the education communities, in the business community, in the nonprofit world, and so on. And so I think this will be, this is the right way to go. Good process.
Okay. You good on that? So how long do you think that might take to identify those folks? Not trying to pin you down too hard on that, but are we talking about a week, 10 days? What are we talking about?
Bruce, I'm going to look to you, but I think we're looking at scheduling those in June, correct?
Yeah, given that it's May, whatever it is, 7th, if we extend those invitations now that we've identified our process, contact our partners, that'll take a few days. On their end, it'll each take, a few days for them to think about who I want to recommend to the commission, to include in the focus groups. They'll send those names to us. We'll then reach out to those individuals. That's a few days. So I think, and then scheduling the Zoom meetings, making sure that everybody has the technology, the access, understands how it's going to work. In the meantime, we've been designing the focus group questions, and we've been retaining New Hampshire Listens fellows as the online facilitators for those focus groups. So I do think it's probably early June, and my understanding at this point is that a lot of school districts will cease their instructional activities in the first week of June based on current conditions. And so we may not want to land right on the same time that schools are actually, that transition's happening, but perhaps shortly after schools have at least stopped their instructional activity. So no later than the second week of June. We conduct these, we'll have the results back and be able to analyze those results. So by, I'd say, 10 days or so after the focus groups, we'd have at least a draft summary report back to this work group to take a look at. Does that sound right, Michelle?
Yeah, and I'll just back up and say, I think at the next work group meeting, we can have a schedule of, a suggested schedule for all of those meetings.
And if you could also please start to identify what are the questions that this work group wants to get from those focus groups. What's the information?
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, is how do you elicit the questions that are going to be consistent throughout the inquiries. So should we be addressing what those questions might be?
Before we jump to that, Mel,
Pardon me?
before you jump to that, when you're
Yes.
talking about who needs to be involved, it sounded like from Jay's comments that we can probably also reach out to the heads of the regional planning commissions.
Yeah,
exactly.
To be able to get a lot of that positioned. And I think, I'm looking at page 5 with the list, and I don't see legislators on there, and there may be a reason. There may be a benefit for not having a lot of political, state political legislators on there now, or maybe there's a reason to have them on there now. I don't know.
Well, I had that question as well, only because in that chart, you're calling a certain group of leaders as elected leaders, and that crossed my mind as well. Well, what about the state representatives or the senators representing those regions? I got another question though before you go. Bruce, the schedule you're talking about on scheduling invites into May, scheduling into second week of group, which group are we talking about for the regional meetings? All of these groups or any of these groups, or 2 or 3 of them at a time, or which group in this chart are we talking about first?
The chart we're looking at is the potential invite, is the sort of the universe of potential invitees.
Yeah, they make sense.
Each focus group, as I said, will have 8 to 10, maybe 12 people in them. We want those to be a mix of the kinds of people that you see on.
Oh, all right. So a mix from all of these.
So when you think about it, in each region, there'll be 2
Okay,
focus
I got
groups,
it.
each one containing a mix of these kinds of people. As far as legislators go, I certainly don't have any objection to that at all. Oftentimes you find your local elected school board members, state council folks, select boards, also we're the head of elected representatives. So sometimes you get kind of a cross fertilization that way anyway. But I also do not want these focus groups to become a place where people dig into some particular position about how we raise money for schools, or what a definition of adequate education is. And so I'm a little bit sensitive to being sure that these don't become forums for political persuasion of a particular point of view. That's all.
Mhm.
Okay, so what we've concluded then is that we're going to be going with the 9 planning regions, and we're going to schedule these for June. And I think that's a good idea, because what I have found is that you get into the latter part of May, and schools are they're focused on shutting the school down, even though they're in the remote learning. This may even be more complex than it would be if we had kids physically there. We've got the list of potential individuals. Carsey's going to send out and contact the individuals to try to populate these two focus groups per region. By May 18th, you're going to come back to us with a list of those regions, schedules, etc. I would suggest that the committee here, between now and the 18th, begin to identify some of the key questions that we may want to elicit data from these participants. Does that sound all right to do? You don't need the questions right now, but you would be by the 18th, and we can conclude those questions. Now, I would assume these sessions will go, what, an hour or so?
An hour, hour and a half.
Hour and a half. So the number of questions that we have to be fairly targeted, because there's not a lot of time for a whole long list of questions. So I think if we could, if you could forward to Michelle and myself, let's say by next Thursday, what those questions might be, so we can call those together and get those out to you to have a chance to look at them for our meeting on the 18th. Does that sound reasonable?
Yep.
It does.
So that date would be, that date is going to
14th?
be, yeah, let me just look at my calendar here.
Yep. May 14th.
That'll be, let's say that, yes, the 14th. The questions will be back to Michelle and myself by the 14th. That sound all right?
Yep, that's good.
Okay.
And send to you and Michelle?
Yeah.
And
I feel good about this conversation.
Yep, good.
Yeah. Michelle, do you want to say something?
Yeah, let me just point something out to prompt your thinking. So on the summary that we just shared with you right before this meeting, on the bottom of page 3, you'll see some questions that were brainstormed by the stakeholder group. And then following that, on question 4, you'll see some questions that were brainstormed by New Hampshire Listens. And this is just to prompt your thinking. We still want, obviously we want your questions, but it'll get your wheels turning.
Be able to focus those areas where there are some common questions that are in there.
Great.
All right?
Yep.
So let's go back to student voice and talk about that a little bit. That was also mentioned in our general conversation that we had with the commission on, how do we gain access to students, and when should that be done? I don't know, Susan, you may have some insight into that, since you're dealing with students, at least higher ed students, more than any of the rest of us. And I know, Corrine, you're dealing with, kids in your area too. I was going to ask you at the end how you're going to be dealing with graduation, but that's another topic.
Mm-hmm.
And we did have some suggestions on some options for dealing with students that some of you came up with. So what's your thoughts on dealing with the student population?
Well, I think that John's comments
are pertinent here as well. I don't think that we're going to really be able to deal with students until perhaps sometime in September. Right now, people are so focused on completing, whether they're college students or K to 12 students. I think it'd be a challenge to put something together unless, I know that there's several high schools that have civics education classes. I don't know if we can, I know that's not a random sample, but if we had information about them, maybe they could be polled for some preliminary information that we could then turn into questions for other groups in September. I think later in September, college students would be interested in commenting on the topic once they kind of get themselves going and they know what life is going to look like for the fall semester.
I agree, Sue. I had written down or suggested also that new to the state is a challenge called MICFA Challenge to engage middle school students in civic action, and they are a little bit young, but it's newly formed. It involves 6 communities around the state. It could be potentially, whether we're on dual sessions in the fall or a hybrid of remote and on-site, it might give that group sort of like a first challenge as they start to, discuss certain issues. I know that by the end of the first year, these schools have to have what's called a soapbox activity that requires the students to present. And I don't know a whole lot more detail of that. There is a state contact for it. And again, it is new. I also thought about youth and government organizations. So those are typically high school kids that are interested in youth, in government per se, so they have a passion for it. And that might be the group if they have any, if you want to collect any data or any work from them, they all have a club advisor in their high schools. So you might be able to stimulate an interest for the advisor to kind of glean some information from the youth and government groups. That might be easier to kind of kick off in the fall because the kids will have been used to remote learning, and the fall is not going to look back to normal, I don't think, either. But it might stimulate some thinking and some opportunity for discussions amongst kids and their advisors.
I do know.
Those are the 2 thoughts I had on student. I think the topic is too technical for the general population of high school kids.
There's also a, David, maybe you can help me. There's a there's a youth legislative group too, that meets on a regular basis that engages both high school and higher ed kids. Yeah. And I was thinking that might be a group that we could at least seek input. It's a very active group too. So I know last year they set out a whole list of legislative priorities that they had. But my sense is that group, again, as you're saying, won't be formed until late September anyway, because by the time you get back into school, whatever that's going to look like next September, and select the people who are going to be there, because there's some governor appointees, et cetera, on that group. So,
Mel, I would also add a couple of higher ed groups. Like I'm thinking about the veterans, who in general are well organized across our various colleges. And for many colleges, there's a parents group of some kind for adult students who are also parents. And so we could reach out to those advisors as well, again in September.
Any others at this point in time? Okay. So I think what we've concluded is that we should hold the student voice activity until the fall. That's one decision, correct?
I would agree with that. You can't make a decision until you know a little bit more information.
And then we've identified 5 or 6 groups that we could then reach out to at that point in time to seek their information. And also at that point in time, we'll have a little more data generated from the study, et cetera, that will give us some background to what we might want to ask them at that point in time. So is that a conclusion that we've made then? Yes, Michelle.
I just want to share one other idea that we've been discussing, but it does, we haven't quite worked out what it would look like online, but I want to share the idea with you in case it could happen in person. And that is to bring families and students together, have them have, you know, parents and families and teachers, you know, in one group kind of going through an experience together and discussing this issue, and having students together on their own, just youth, going through, you know, some prompts and discussion of the issue, and then bringing them together to hear from each other.
Yeah.
And it's a, I haven't wrapped my head around converting it to online, but I actually, I have no doubt that we could do it. I mean, an example is, and this is the part that I think we'd have to just be clear about, is sort of helping people understand what are the implications of how it works now, and what is it. It's sort of the work that the commission is doing to figure out what's the problem we're trying to solve, helping families and students give input on, you know, what is the problem that keeps being named, and what are their thoughts about that. And so I won't go further because there's a lot more to think about, but that's just another piece. And I do think that the student, you know, if families are there with their students, it may help people to feel that it's less likely that students are being manipulated. Even though I think students bring a very nice independent thinking brain to most things that I've seen them participate in. So, but it's just another.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. I think that would be, to do a couple of those in 2 different parts of the state might be a very interesting experience. So we'll hold on that though, as we begin to look at just how we're going to do the total interaction with the student population. This might be one aspect of it. So, all right, good. Any other issues around the students that we're going to hold till September? We got some groups that we're going to look at, and then decide exactly how we might want to hold those. I mean, regardless of whether they go back to school or not, they're used to Zooming, so it's
Right.
it's
It
an
won't be new.
interesting medium. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it really is kind of interesting because, you know, if we, and I'm not suggesting we only use Zoom, believe me, but I'm saying that if you wanted to get voices from across the state, this would be a medium that could actually be used very, very easily, because one of the dilemmas we always have, and you know this, Corrine, probably better than all of us, and I see Rick's here too, but is trying to get people from the North Country into a central, you think going from Conway, let's say, over to Haverhill is a day activity practically. So it's this medium helps to facilitate that in a drastic kind of a way.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so we've talked about work groups, the stuff. We talked about the granite poll. We're going to get the key questions. You're going to come back with Michelle, who would be some of the people who would be involved in these sessions that we're going to have.
Yep.
So I think between now and September, we've kind of mapped out some of the activities that we're going to be doing. Obviously, the focus groups that we're going to be having in the planning regions are going to be key, in the next 8 to 10 weeks. I think on the community conversations after September, Again, this was an intent to try to take some of the scenarios that the commission and the other work groups have been creating to utilize those in, one per region, just to test it out to get some feedback on that. And we can deal with that later in the summer as we begin to do our work. Are there things I'm missing? Dave, do you have any comments about what we've done so far this afternoon?
No, I think you're laying it out pretty well, Mel. I think one of the things that that we're going to want to talk about and at the work groups and at full commission meetings is when and how we go about sort of interfacing between the work groups, because there's obviously some things that what you're doing is going to help to inform fiscal policy and help to inform adequacy, and we need to figure out when we need to get those things. So obviously the practicalities of timing are really important, but also we've got to have essentially a final report December 1st, and which really means a pretty complete final draft November 1st. So so we've got to make sure we keep the larger time frame and the schedule in mind too.
Right. Yeah. So.
Can I ask a question as we start to think about sample questions? It probably would be a good idea if we shared the sample questions we were thinking of. I mean, you'd have to have a quick turnaround, or as the other work groups are starting to develop, what questions they want more information on?
I think that's a great idea, Corrine. It's the second half of what you talked about.
Yeah.
That I think is going to be interesting to the work groups. Not so much the questions, but the information we're looking for.
Yep.
And Michelle and Bruce and their team can come up with the questions. We're just looking. I mean, I'll just make something up right now. How would Granite Staters feel about changes to the statewide education property tax? Something like that.
Mm.
And I'm just making that up. That's not a policy suggestion.
No.
We won't hold you to
it. But I think there is an assumption there that those who are engaged in this process understand what that is,
right.
Mm-hmm.
and how it's currently being, what its original intent was, what its current operation is too. So there's some background information that may have to be garnered for some of these questions too, to provide that. I'm just going to make sure that there's a level conversation when it's asked.
Right. But also, how do Granite Staters feel about the statewide education property tax? If that's what a work group is looking for,
yes,
could be that the questions don't have anything to do with SWEPT. I mean, maybe they don't rely on any detailed working knowledge about what SWEPT is, because I think that's it. Most people probably don't really know what SWEPT is. I mean, unless you're on a school board, mm-hmm. or the House or Senate education committees, it's a pretty arcane, thing.
People just see it on their tax form.
Yeah. Well, I think they know it's for education. They know what it stands for. But the relationship between that as a it's a fiscal policy issue, and the relationship between SWEPT, the cost of adequacy, and state funding is a pretty interesting one, because you start changing any of those things and it really affects the entire system.
Yeah. And can we rely on you, David, and Bruce, since you're populating all of these work groups, to basically seek those questions from those work groups that they may have for this too? All right.
Yeah, I'll actually give a concrete example, and I don't know if this is where we'll go or not, but for example, this morning, the adequacy work group talked a lot about, to use Jay's language, what goes in the bushel basket that defines adequacy as basic and universal for all school districts, and what are the additional expenses related to schools that are not part of a basic adequacy sort of profile or the bushel basket. And I can imagine, for example, identifying 10 components of the educational experience and process, everything from transportation to school breakfasts, to preschool education, to behavioral health counselors, and ask in either face-to-face conversations, Zoom conversations, or surveys to rank order the importance of those elements of education in order to give the commission some sense of where how the public views the scope of and sort of responsibility of our public schools. And I just totally made that up, but that's how we link the work, for example, of the adequacy group, which is trying to define the universe of what is a basic core adequate education, and what the public believes they're willing to, it should go in the basket, and B, what they're willing to pay for. Second.
Yeah, and I think on that, Bruce, this is an interesting topic, because my sense is many parents and many in the community, now you have to realize that we now have maybe 25-30% of the population that have kids in school. Like me, we've got our 2 kids are out of school now. Mm-hmm. So we don't know fully what those services are in schools.
Yeah.
So when you begin to look at the issue like social services to families, what the percent of free lunch is for kids, those are not in the mindset, I would believe, of most community people, because they're not touching the schools on a regular basis. And so there's the adequacy question that you're raising is very important. They may not see those as even, they just looking at the reading, writing, and arithmetic, and maybe some technology thrown in there, without understanding the breadth of what the support system is that's there to provide the right kind of a learning environment for kids. So I think you're right. I think some of those issues are just not in even the mindsets of people who are looking at schools. And how we get to that is going to be part of that informed conversation, hopefully, we're going to have.
Hey, Mel?
Yeah.
This is Rick.
Welcome, Rick.
I had a little bit of a discussion with the group this morning, even though I'm not on that group, but we were talking about a proportionate taxing rate and all that. The folks you need to contact in the communities to find out are the school board members. School board members, elected members, set that tax rate. They, in the communities, and know what dollars that they're looking for, how that's going to impact their taxing rate within their community. I found that in Haverhill, yes, the average Joe walking the street doesn't understand SWEP. They don't understand that there's 40 municipalities that receive more than they really need. And about $27 million, Dave, somewhere around there. And so I think that if you were to contact school boards and do a survey of school board members to find out what their position is on the fiscal policies, I think you'd get some wonderful information back.
Okay. All right. Any other comments? I think unless I'm missing something, I think we've covered the agenda, haven't we? Looks to me like we have. Okay, so I think we know what we're going to be expecting on the 18th, which is going to be the listing of potential focus groups with the population of who might be in those focus groups. We're going to be trying to develop some of the questions for those focus groups. David and Bruce are going to be working with their respective groups to see if they've got some questions that they want to add to that focus. And we're going to hold the student conversation until September, late September. And we're going to hold the poll until September, the community poll. Anything else that we need to do before we go back to our, with the exception of Susan and Corinne, who are not being hobbled in place as they do their chores. Oh, the question I was going to ask you, Corinne, how are you going to deal with graduation up in Littleton?
Well, it's a challenge. We've been meeting with seniors and families and whatnot. And every time they come up with a plan, I have to remind them, but you can't have a large group gathering that's going to congregate. Even if you're talking about a ball field, a parking lot, kids are going to run to each other and parents are going to run in. So they had to go back to the drawing board this morning. And I said, you can't have more than 10 kids. So they're going to adjust it. So, but we did stick to our regular dates of all senior activities because people make a lot of plans around those dates and calendars. And I really fear that all those districts who have put it out to July or August are, you know, if they're expecting a large group gathering in those months, I'm afraid they're not going to be able to meet those deadlines.
How many graduates do you have?
We're going to do a live, but in a different realm.
How many graduates do you have?
They have 48 here.
Oh, really? So
But
that's a pretty good
North
class.
Country districts have, you know, 2 dozen. I mean, Pittsburgh can go out in the field. They only have 6 or 8. So, you know, they can do that. But at 48, you can't have 48 in a field sitting 6 feet apart. It's just not allowable. So we got to figure out a venue with cars and drive up and it's a lot of logistics.
Yeah.
As David well knows, he's done this so many times. Our graduation is in a, how would you define it? A barn of some sort?
It's a barn.
Oh, I've been to those graduations in Hopkinton. It is in one of those, the fairgrounds?
Yeah, fairgrounds barn.
I've been to those.
Yeah. Nobody comes out of there without dusty shoes. There's no question about that.
And it can be pretty tight quarters too.
Yeah, it does. Oh yeah,
pretty special though. That's as all the graduations.
Why not? I always expected a cow to moo in the background, but it didn't happen.
All right. Any other? Bruce.
One thing.
Just one other thing. This morning, for example, in the adequacy group, we recognized that we need to look out a little bit further ahead on the calendar. So right now, this group is scheduled to meet on Monday, May 18th. We'll go to the every other Mondays for the work group meetings. The adequacy work group this morning realized that draws things out over too long a period of time to do the tasks that we have there. So we added a meeting on Thursday, May 21st to be able to just, especially on the front end here, to really get some traction and to begin to interact with the consulting firm that will be in place by then as well. Now, this engagement work group probably will not interact with the consulting firm as much as the 2 other work groups, I'll say that. However, in terms of people's schedule and anticipating what's coming up, I wonder if you want to at least hold a chunk of time on sometime like May 21st or 22nd, in case you do decide you realize that you want another meeting in order to make progress. So that's well,
we can do that, and then we can also cancel the meeting too if we don't need it, correct? Yeah, because the dilemma we've got is you have to put this in the calendar.
Well, Jen's on the call here. I think that for these work group meetings, we decided that we just needed a 24-hour notice to post them and to get them up on the calendar. Did I understand that right, Jen?
Yeah, if you guys are comfortable with that, there only has to be 24 hours notice for the commission meeting. And if you visit the general court website right now, although they may have taken it down, but for the municipal and county meeting, they put, that's not the official notice for that meeting, but it's kind of an example where it put that there's a remote meeting and it listed what was happening. So I think that you could probably request that kind of notice if you don't have time to make the calendar.
Okay.
as long as we have, some time to put it up there.
So let's reserve the 21st as a potential meeting for us, depending upon what we get, what the work that we get done on the 18th. Is that okay for everyone? Same time,
Same time.
place.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and we can talk about this on when the commission meets on the 11th. We can talk about work group calendars a little bit, and it still gives us plenty of time to get stuff for the following week's calendar, which will close Wednesday next week. So one other thing I wanted to mention too, for the for work groups that are meeting on Monday, May 18th, we're going to overlap the fiscal policy and adequacy work groups by an hour so that we can both attend we can both listen, we can both hear from Reaching Higher New Hampshire.
Yeah.
So, so fiscal policy is going to meet from 1 to 3 on Monday, May 18th. Adequacy is going to meet from 2 to 4, and between 2 and 3, the back half of fiscal policy and the front half of adequacy, we're going to have a presentation from Reaching Higher New Hampshire about the whole picture and the correlation of data and with outcomes.
Okay. Good. Sounds good.
So I don't know if that just something to consider. We can talk offline. You and Jay and I can talk about, and Bruce can talk about that offline. Or actually, you can just schedule your meeting another time and on the 18th, and you can tune in for that hour. Members of the
Yeah, well, it might be good for us to hear.
Yeah, can just tune in for that hour. So yeah.
Okay.
Great.
All right. Anything else, folks? Everybody staying happy and not. I've had this whole thing is better be happy than snappy. So as you're in place with your loved ones or your significant others, it's better to be happy than snappy. Believe me. Anything else?
Coming up next, fiscal policy at 3.
Woohoo!
Great. Thanks so much,
everybody.
guys.
Thank you,
See you.
Mel.
Thanks.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Bye.
Be well.